Hi, my name is Tiffany Golden, and thank you for joining my graduate lecture, Keeping It Real Magical Realism in Middle Grade Fiction. In this lecture, we're going to cover what is magical realism, where did it come from, and we'll review some modern middle grade examples. So, first, let's ask the big question: what is magical realism? Magical realism is the inclusion of fantastical elements into a real world setting. So let's take a moment to distinguish it. Would these examples count as magical realism? We have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, or The Last Day of Summer by Lamar Giles. These are fantasy. They include fantastical elements, but they are set in a fantasy or magic based world, meaning that the world isn't surprised by the appearance of the fantastical. This is a key distinguishing factor. The world incorporates the elements. Okay, so let's see if these books count as magical realism. Zora and Me by Victoria Bond and T.R. Simon, As Brave as You by Jason Reynolds, and The Harlem Charade by Natasha Tarpley. These are mysteries. They have some mysterious, initially unexplained, and often fantastical seeming elements. But those elements have logical and explainable material world origins. The origin of whatever mystery has been set up by the author is from the seen and known world. So magical realism includes the non material world into the real world experience. This is across genre. So, magical realism isn't a genre as much as it is an element. It can be included in romance, coming of age, action adventure, etc. Any place where the real world comes in contact with the unseen world. So, where did magical realism begin? While magical realism has writers all over the globe, it is most synonymous with Latin America, with many authors connecting the seen and unseen worlds in their works, reflecting the acknowledgement of the unseen in their daily lives. So let's talk about the term a little bit. The term originated in 1925 to describe German paintings studied by art critic Franz Roh. And then the term traveled to Latin America in 1927 through Roh's book, Post-Expressionism, Magical Realism. The 1940s and 50s launched a boom in magical realism literature throughout Latin America. Now, this boom shifted the focus from visual art to literary works. Now, here I'm going to include magical realism Latin American authors of note. Each one of these authors have made a great contribution to magical realism in the literary world. And these are just sampling of the numerous works that they've produced. So let's see magical realism in action. Here I'm going to show how magical realism is used in two classic texts. The first is The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 1968. Now, the real world is a small, unidentified island where a dead body washes up on the shore. The fantastical is that the villagers assign the body unrealistic physical features. He is seen as the most handsome even in his bloated death. His height and weight make him a magical person compared to the villagers. The escapism or the dream is that the villagers seek change and they use this body as a catalyst for how they create new norms in their village. So, dissatisfied or bored with their life, they use this body to then help them imagine something different for themselves. Our next example is Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, and this is from 1989. So, the real world is a ranch during the Mexican American Revolution between 1910 and 1917. The fantastical is that even before birth, protagonist Tita is able to emote through food and transmit these emotions to others. The escapism that Esquivel uses is that Tita's food is used to express strong emotion during a period of repression and liberation. So Esquivel uses food as a means of envisioning something bigger and feeling larger emotions. Now, I will also venture to say that many countries populated by people of color tend to have the unseen woven into their what we would call indigenous and pre-industrial cultures and practices. So they're going to be producing more writers who incorporate what we call magical realism into their works. The quote unquote real world often includes the impacts of imperialism and or colonialism in the same works. Now let's take a look at a few modern examples, but first, let's define middle grade fiction. Middle grade fiction are books aimed at readers aged between 8 and 12 years old. Generally focuses on the protagonist finding place in social and family environments. And the readers appreciate self sufficient heroes that venture out and explore new territory. This is why you often find a protagonist orphaned or in some kind of blended family. This is an effort to increase their autonomy and agency. So, in the following examples that we have, we'll highlight the use of mythological or religious elements, ghosts, spirits, and living people, characterizations of people communicating between the now and hereafter, intermingling of events in time in random sequences in time, so we'll have time jumps. And then we'll show how writers of color tend to employ ancient and or modern cultural practices. And this is often to juxtapose to modern post-colonial impact. So our first example is City of the Beasts by Isabel Allende. Now this example is more of an advanced middle grade, definitely a young adult read. But Isabel Allende is magical realism royalty with so many revered titles. So she leads because I wanted to include a major contributing magical realism writer from Latin America. So the plot: 15-year-old Alex Cole is forced to stay with his fearless, tough minded grandmother when his mother becomes ill. And Alexander joins his grandmother on a dangerous expedition to a remote part of the Amazon forest where he must learn to navigate the hidden world of the rainforest and unknown parts of himself. So, one of the first magical realism elements is very early in the novel. Allende clues the reader that the Amazon setting will possess spirits unseen in the rest of the world. You're going to see the most mysterious jungles in the world, Alexander. There are places where spirits appear in broad daylight. Another example is a character named Nadia shares with Alex that an indigenous man that they encounter travels with his wife and she is a spirit. Walima has been there many times with his wife. She is always with him. I didn't see her, Alex admitted. She is a spirit. Not everyone can see her. Did you? Another element that Allende uses is people communicating between the now and hereafter, specifically where Alex calls on his deceased grandfather to help him in the face of danger. He whispered the name of his grandfather Joseph, asking him for help in this moment of mortal danger, and then began to play. I'm going to point out here that Joseph, his grandfather, was a master flute player, and that Alexander had inherited his grandfather's flute and took it to the Amazon, and that is what he began to play. Now, in terms of cultural connections, Allende uses this novel to question the benefit of religious colonialism. She shows the rare life of a community untouched by any imperialistic or colonial influences, including all of their preserved traditions and abilities. That specific cultural connection is what makes City of the Beast such a beautiful and powerful book. The real world is the Amazon, and then she brings to life all of these notions that are just unknown from a world that we have never seen before. And I really love this book for that. Our next example is actually one of my favorite books right now. It's Spirit Hunters by Ellen O. And Ellen O is the co-founder and president of We Need the First Books, and she's also an author of both middle grade and young adult titles. The plot is that 12-year-old Harper Rain finds herself immediately uncomfortable in the new house that her family moves into from New York, escaping a past that Harper can't remember. As strange events escalate in her rumored haunted house, Harper must piece together what's missing from her memory in order to protect herself and her brother from an entity inside the house. Yikes. So, one of the first elements is a religious element, and Harper is encouraged to use holy water to protect her home from her friend who suspects that the rumors that the house being haunted are true. Deo shrugged. Well, why don't we get some holy water and sprinkle it around the house anyway? I bet it can't hurt. The talk of holy water and hauntings was beginning to make Harper's head pound all over again. She rubbed her temple, willing the pain away. Another example of magical realism in Spirit Hunters is that O includes several ghosts within the story. Now, the distinction between ghosts and spirits being that ghosts are the spirits of people who were formerly alive, and spirits are entities who were never people but always existed in the supernatural realm. So, in this realm, in this story, there's Billy, the house ghost, Rose, the friendly ghost, Madeline, the troubled ghost from Harper's past, and then you have Mrs. Devereaux, the powerful ghost slash spirit that helps Harper with the house entities. We also have people communicating between the now and hereafter. Harper speaks with many ghosts, including Mrs. Devereaux, to strategize removing the haunting ghost from our home. Mrs. Devereaux, I summon you, Harper shouted. The air turned electric, and a warm wind filled the room. At your service, dearest, Mrs. Devereaux said as she materialized in the room. The ghost boy snarled in fury. Mrs. Devereaux floated next to Harper, staring William down, even as she urged Harper to start the ritual. Another element, intermingling of events in time. Harper is transported back in time to learn more about the haunting ghost William, aka Billy. Immediately, Harper was in another time and place. It was daytime and she was no longer in the present. Their new modern kitchen was gone, and instead they stood in a room out of an old black and white television show. So now we're going to move on to cultural connections. And one of the connections that I love is that O highlights the Korean Mudang. And the Korean Mudang in Korean religion is a priestess who employs magic to effect cures, tell fortune, soothe spirits of the dead, and to repulse evil. Here, her grandmother is saying, "No, my dear, this is my way. It is steeped in the culture of the Korean Mudang. But you are not Mudang or a shaman. You are a young spirit hunter in a new country, and you must find your own way." I really appreciate this book. Um, Ellen O takes us from, puts us in the real world, which is in Washington D.C., and then brings all these wonderful elements of ghosts and exorcisms and purification rituals, and then the Korean Mudang into this wonderful story. Our final example is from author Ronald L. Smith, whose writing often has a brushstroke of creepiness, and Hoodoo is no exception to that. The plot is that 12-year-old Hoodoo Hatcher was born into a family with a rich tradition of practicing folk magic, hoodoo as most people call it. But even though his name is Hoodoo, he can't seem to cast a simple spell. Then a strange, mysterious man called the Stranger comes to town, and Hoodoo starts dreaming of the dead rising from their graves. And even worse, he learns that the Stranger is looking for a boy named Hoodoo. The entire town is at risk from the Stranger's black magic, and only Hoodoo can defeat him. He'll just need to learn how to conjure first. One distinction to make here is that even though Hoodoo, as a magical practice, is known in his family and community, it's not a sole hoodoo world. The world is still our world in Alabama in the 1930s. So that is where the real world experience comes in for this particular setting. Now, the magical realism elements, one is that Hoodoo's family has strong roots in Southern Christian tradition and he prays often. Here's an example of a prayer that he prays to protect him and his family, his Mama Frances, which is his grandmother, his grandfather, Paul Manuel, and to shine the light and protect them from evil. And then he closes it, "Thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen." This is pretty much a standard, I'm talking straight to God, being respectful prayer that you'll find within the Southern Black tradition. Now, this particular prayer, where he says, "I said a little prayer that made me think of something else, so I whispered it out loud," seems more like a recited, memorized prayer specifically to Saint Michael that he repeats. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend me in battle. Be my defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, I humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. So, another element that Smith includes is that he includes several ghosts and spirits within the story. There's Zacharias Kane, Hoodoo's father, who remains nameless, Mama Frances, and a spirit that talks through a crow. So, switching right over to people communicating between the now and hereafter, hoodoo has an exchange with the spirit that is embodied in the crow. Caw, caw, the spirit squawked. Don't fear me, child. I blinked and jumped back, then swallowed. How do you, how can you talk? The bird buried its beak in its blue black feathers. Danger coming, hoodoo. I was sent by your daddy from the crossroads. He's stuck. My daddy? What do you mean stuck? What crossroads? The crossroads, boy, the crow said, like I was supposed to know what it was talking about. You got to set something right for him or he can't pass on. How can you talk? I asked again, not even believing I was talking to a bird that knew my name. And then I remembered Mrs. Snuff's words: search for the black crow, beware the stranger. I'm a spirit boy, the crow said, from the other side. I actually really love that. And then there's another example of hoodoo communicating between the now and hereafter. Here in our next example, who is speaking with his father who's in purgatory. The closer I got, the more the light turned into a shape, the shape of a man. I was only a few feet away, and it swayed in the ghostly breeze. Hoodoo. Tingles ran up and down my neck. Daddy, I called. I don't have long, son. You have to be careful. I looked at him. I was only 5 when he died and didn't remember a whole lot about him, but his face brought back some memories. I could make out his thin mustache and beard, his strong jaw, and his dark brown eyes like two smooth stones floating in a river. So the cultural connections that Smith uses here are, aside from naming the protagonist hoodoo, Smith features the practice of hoodoo itself. So it's also known as root work or conjuring. Hoodoo is a religious practice that integrates the traditional magic practice of African tribes, Native American herbal remedies, along with the European folklore into a new spiritual system. The rituals and teachings of hoodoo have been passed down through generations from one practice practitioner to another. And I think one of the things that is important about hoodoo is that some of its origins are being brought over by West African people enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not just magical practices from African tribes, but these were West African people enslaved who brought over their particular practices and then combined them with Native American, Indigenous American herbal remedies and included the European folklore into the system, which they had to do to keep themselves safe and practice their own culture. Smith also includes important community members known as root workers and conjurers. There are many um, root workers and conjurers in this book. And in this novel, Ma Francis, who is Hoodoo's grandmother, is a powerful root worker, and his father became even more powerful. So, oftentimes, conjuring is a family affair. It is not unusual to see multiple generations of hoodoo and root workers in the same bloodline. So, Ronald L. Smith, in this particular book, takes the real world of rural Alabama in the 1930s and brings on the other side of purgatory and ghosts and spirits, including root work and magic, to make a really interesting read. So, to find more on magical realism, there's a book called Magical Realism by Maggie Ann Bowers, and this book really goes over the history of magical realism, the history of the term, the many different mutations of the term, um, how it began in art and then moved to literature, and then some major key players in each part of the transition of magical realism. So if you'd like to get a good history the on the topic, this is a great book for you. And then there's Delicious Strangeness, a pocket guide to magical realism by Stephanie Barbet Hammer. This book is if you're interested in writing magical realism. How do you bring the unseen world to the mundane, often real world? So there are writing tips and tools and tricks that this book has laid out in order to incorporate magical realism into your writing. I also wanted to include some authors that are non middle grade, but that are also considered magical realism writers. For if you're interested in seeing other works, here are some other authors for you to explore in your own time. So thank you again for joining me in my graduate lecture, Keeping It Real, Magical Realism in Middle Grade Fiction. I'd like to thank Spalding University for the opportunity to talk about a writing element that I find fascinating. I appreciate your time and please have a wonderful day. Thank you.